Well, thank you for having me back here in Lowville. I was here June 4th, 2011, when Jerry Perrin invited me up to do a similar program that we did over at the Jackson Cemetery. And we did a lecture here and then did some preservation hands-on over there. So I'm glad to be back. Some of you may remember that, and that may be ancient history for others, but I'll give you a little bit of background on myself first before I begin. People ask, how did you get involved in cemeteries? So, and it's multifaceted for me. It's of course, upbringing. Both of my grandmothers were big into family history. My paternal grandmother would always bring me to the cemetery. My grandfather had died before I was born, so we'd go and put the flowers out, clean the stone, brush all the grass off, do all that. Then we go to the rest of the cemetery. Well, here's my parents, and there's their parents, and there's their parents. So that just brings you to a place of value, knowing that information. On the other side, my other grandmother was born in a cemetery. That sounds quite strange, but her father, my great-grandfather, was a caretaker at Oakwood Cemetery in Troy, a 300-acre cemetery. He was one of the youngest boys of 12 children that wasn't going to inherit the family farm. So he stayed in agriculture. He worked on other farms. He worked as a caretaker in Oakwood Cemetery. I have his World War I draft registration card that lists his name, William Henry Banker, address Oakwood Cemetery, Troy, New York. I said, that's pretty weird. Most people with that address are exempt from the draft, but he was one of the few. So he was living in a caretaker's home when you were still born at home. My grandmother was born in 1919, so she was born in the cemetery. So I get it from being brought to the cemetery, and I think I get a little bit through the gene pool as well. So, and I'm also a historian. I went to college in SUNY Potsdam. My second major was history. My first was math. I had a minor in chemistry, and what do you do if you don't teach with those degrees? So I had a career in something else for 20 years that became less than gratifying. You know, money was good, benefits, all that, but there was more to life than that. So my love of history started me back into genealogy, which led me to cemeteries, which led me to see the need there was for preserving those. And the one cemetery, again, back to Troy, New York, I'm a Rensselaer County guy. One of the family cemeteries that have descendants of a Revolutionary War general. I went to see what I could get off those tombstones there. And I found a piece of marble about the size of a quarter. That's all that was left of the cemetery because it was adjacent property to the Troy City landfill. And when they capped the landfill, whatever was left of the cemetery went with it, probably buried under feet of clay and everything. So that led me to saying I need to do more than just complain and research. Something has to be done to stop this. So that's I started getting involved. That was back in the early 2000s, and started getting involved in preservation, both in cemeteries and in historic structures. So now I'm president, treasurer, secretary of different historical societies. I served on the board of the Association for Gravestone Studies for 13 years, and all these things that you just go in both feet and try to do what you can. So I'm here to share my knowledge, and you can interrupt me at any time. You know, we need to talk about preserving these graveyards, conserving the stones. So we have some definitions up here. I don't like to use the word restoration. To me, that implies you're going to make it look new. Something that's 200 years old should not and cannot look new again without doing detrimental harm to it. So stabilizing, preserving, and conserving are the words I like to use. So as we go through, and this applies to more cemeteries than what we were talking about with the regulated cemeteries. It does apply to those as well, but it goes to the family, the private, the religious, all cemeteries. If you're going to try to fix a problem, you need to assess the problem first. So I know there's been a lot of talk about these family burial grounds that are landlocked within properties. You know, you have to see who controls the cemetery, what are the rules, and what laws and or rules apply. And they vary based on the type of cemetery And again, we use that term abandoned cemetery very fluidly. It's not. Abandoned cemetery under New York state law has to meet certain conditions. These are just family burial grounds. And that's where my passion started. But again, now I work in 500-acre cemeteries as well. So when we're talking about the problems, we need to assess the whole issue. Cemetery security is a major issue, maybe not so much in rural Lewis County, but if you're working in city cemeteries where you've got vagrancy and you've got homelessness and people moving in, vandalism, drug deals, prostitution, all kinds of things happen in cemeteries that you wouldn't imagine in city cemeteries. That's a more serious issue. We talked about the town law requiring a fence. That eliminates part of it. But if the fence isn't maintained, what good is a fence that's got an 8-foot gap in it they can walk in? If you don't have lighting and other issues, sometimes that will deter. The main thing for security is having a good element in the cemetery deters the bad element. So encouraging tourism and people to come there and use it as, COVID was great for cemeteries. What a great place to walk and be isolated, yet you're out in the open where you weren't worried about contracting the virus. So security is an issue. You got to consider that, but not in every cemetery. Documentation. There is loads of documentation out there, some of it good, some of it bad, some in private collections, some in public records, some in historical societies. You never know where you're going to find it. We're just talking. When you're looking for early records, a lot of times somebody has been there before you, and it could have been 100 years ago, it could have been 20 years ago. So don't waste your time doing an effort that's already been done, but find that documentation. The WPA did things, the DAR did things, the Grange had done things here. A lot of people have documented those cemeteries, as well as having the cemetery having their original documentation or not. The conservation work that needs to be done is part of the biggest thing, and that's what we're really going to focus on. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Archaeology is something you need to consider, especially when you're trying to think about putting new interments, whether it's a cremain in a family lot in somebody's property. Is there documentation? Is there somebody there? Just because there's no stone doesn't mean there's not a body. So, if you don't find records, there are ways to do archaeology through ground penetrating radar that are non-invasive, maybe inconclusive at times. There's some other methods that if you come to the cemetery, I'll demonstrate, and we won't get into that too much today, but there is another way to find graves without actually digging in the ground. And I'm sure we'll have people shaking their heads on that. Landscaping is a big part of cemeteries. The early churchyards and municipal cemeteries, the town square cemetery, they weren't anything but lines of graves. But you get into the rural cemetery movement that the Lowville Rural Cemetery is, based on what they were doing in Cambridge, Mass. The first rural cemetery from the 1830s, making it a park-like setting. The landscape is as important as the reason there are graves there for maintenance and planning over time. You may have to get involved in landscape architects. That's going to a higher level, but you need to assess the problems with the trees and the landscape and erosion and all kinds of things that are happening. Promoting interest in cemetery preservation is always one of the toughest things. We're talking about that, having school kids get involved in a project. The value there is just incredible, because they're going to carry that forward their whole lives if you catch them at the right time. But again, getting community involved, getting groups involved. If you're the only person that cares about that cemetery, what's going to happen when you're gone? You need to promote that interest. And then the biggest question is, how do you pay for it all? And that was one of the other speakers' big topics. What funds? So you have to think outside the box for private foundations, public thing. You can raise money standing on a street corner with a cop. I worked in a cemetery in Maine 3 years ago in COVID. A town has 352 people year round, and we're working on the main cemetery on the main drag. And some lady came up and said, I can't help you. I'm not physically able, but I got a lawn chair and I got a piece of plywood. I'm going to paint a sign, donations for cemetery. She raised $3,000 in a day and a half in a community of 352 people. Can you imagine? don't think that it's not possible. Think outside the box a little bit. So funding is a big part of it, and we can talk more specifically about that later. So developing a plan is important. We just don't jump into it with both feet and expect things to go well, because usually there's an old saying, the road to somewhere is paved with good intentions. So you need to have a plan and think about it. So developing that plan is so important. We have problems, we have to identify them, we have to prioritize them. And it all depends on your funding, your manpower, your skill level, how much can be done at any one time. So a phased approach is always reasonable based on the size of the cemetery. But even beyond that, you have to have a plan for maintenance long-term. So I've worked with Eagle Scout projects and Girl Scout projects. They go in and clean up a cemetery, then they go away. And in a matter of a couple of years, it's overgrown again, nothing's happening. You need to think about what's going to keep that clear, what's going to keep it identifiable for the future. So documentation, I touched on that a little bit. I'm not fast. Okay, an early step is finding that documentation. It's out there. You know, somewhere there's something. It may be on the internet, it may be in a shoebox somewhere, it may be in an archive. Find that information and then review it for accuracy and potential changes. We can survey the entire cemetery, and that doesn't mean hiring a surveyor to do that. It can be done with volunteers and some simple forms, and try to record the current condition. And part of the documentation will be drawing up a map if one doesn't exist. And that can be as simple as using a piece of graph paper for a small family cemetery. I mean, now with Google Maps and all the virtual stuff we have, we can take a lot of those aerial shots and work with them to help make that mapping process easier. You know, if you've got somebody that knows the CAD system, I mean, you can make this professional. You can do something as simple as, there are a bunch of forms out there that are available online that will give you a simple survey of each individual marker. So we want to go through and record the current condition. And these can be something you just manufacture on your own computer, keep it simple to what your types of stone and situation is, or it can be very complicated because you have a 12-acre cemetery that's got multitude of problems and stones. So this information, this is from a National Trust one. There's a lot of others out there available, and I can get people copies. The main old cemetery I work with has developed their own. It's very specific. So the other best source of documentation is photography. And again, most of you remember the days of trying to take 35mm shots and getting them the right exposure and the right light, and then hoping they come out when you develop them. You know, it was a nightmare and a headache and expensive. Today with digital photography, what our camera phones can do, it's amazing, and the clarity we get. So it is a good way to have a, you know, picture's worth 1,000 words. It'll summarize a lot of things for you with that. So that gets included with your documentation package. So, you know, then the biggest issue now is how do we store that data? You know, do we do print copies? Are they in color? Are they in black and white? Are they stored on a CD? Are they in the cloud or whatever? But having multiple places for that information so that when we're gone, the information is still there. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. There are some cemetery management programs, but they're pretty costly. You know, that's the problem. I haven't found, you know, the perfect app on your phone that's out in the free public domain. You know, there are companies that will help cemeteries manage burial and everything else that will do all that for you. But as general programs, I don't know of any. There may be some out there, but you know. And old school, making a grid and then triangulating to get the exact location to help you map. If it's not fully treed, I mean, getting Google Maps and aerial shot, but if there's a lot of tree cover, unless it's done in the winter, you know, they're virtually worthless. You get a big cloud of green, you know, so.
Just try to paraphrase the question.
Okay, so the question is, how do we, if we want to document everything and we've taken all these photos, how can we put those with GPS locations into a map? And that, again, if you know somebody who is great with a CAD system, it can be easily done. And again, the old school mapping, you know, just doing it on graph paper. I'm old school. I'm sorry, I'm becoming a dinosaur no matter, you know, I feel. Yeah, find a teenager who can figure out a way to hack a program to make it easier to do it for you. So it is difficult, and there's such a need for it. And there are companies who will come in and do that for you, so they don't want to let their software go or whatever program they've developed. They'll, you know, you can hire them to do GPR and do mapping and all that, but it's extremely expensive. You know, it's a valuable tool, so you can do that yourself. But back to photography again, and then how do you store them? And then there's a lot of public access websites. There's Billion Graves. There's Find a Grave. If you don't know that one, I mean, it's problem with Find a Grave. It's owned by Ancestry now, so it's still free at this point. At some point, I imagine when they build it up to about a gazillion graves, they're gonna make it part of their paid services. So again, people are putting photographs on there and information that is documentation, but a lot of it, most of it is done by amateurs who may or may not be putting the proper information or reading the stones or even proper cemeteries. Old cemeteries on family farms tend to go by more than one name. You can have them listed 6 different ways on the internet. It adds to another level of complexity that we have to deal with. But that is a great resource as well for getting that out into the public space. So, you know, and we document with photographs too. For me, you know, I can spend hours writing treatment reports. A lot of times it's easier doing before and after photographs. That's all customers want. You do some intermittent photos as the work proceeds, and that can show techniques and what we're using. And then, you know, keep that all photo documented. But the biggest problem with photography is getting a good, clear photograph. And not to knock genealogical groups, but they will post all kinds of horrible things to do to the stone to make them visible, from flour to shaving cream to other things to smear into the surface so that it highlights the inscription. But if you talk to any photographer, whether it's, you know, amateur or professional, what's the key to photographs? Lighting. Lighting is the key. So if we're outside in the cemetery, when the natural light is hitting it right, we can get a very good picture. Well, that's okay today, but tomorrow it's going to be raining. How are we going to do that? That becomes another problem. We can reflect light with a huge flashlight, or if we have a sunny day and the stone is under a tree in the shade or backlit, we can take a stone like this sandstone that you can see the sun is coming from behind, so you can't read the inscription. It looks like it's illegible. Lighting is the key. We can go to Walmart or your favorite home store. I'm not promoting Walmart. Get one of those $6 closet mirrors and reflect the light. And so here's a stone in the shade. Here's Ruthie Brown in Connecticut capturing the light in the mirror and reflecting it back across the face of the stone so that you can now read the inscription and get a clear photograph to put on Find a Grave. I love it when people put photos on there that you can't read and then you're relying on their transcription to be accurate. Yes.
I found sometimes if you angle your hip in a different position, like from the top looking down or the bottom looking up.
Right. So the comment is, you know, changing the angle of your camera up, below, sideways can change the reflection of the light in the stone. So you can see these are incised letters. They're carved in. So we need the light to come across and shadow. That's what makes the inscription pop. So without having the light, you can angle things differently. You can take that photo, bring it home, put it on your computer, start tweaking it. You know, change the contrast, change the exposure, do whatever you need to get that to pop for you. But this is a good way on a sunny day. On a less than sunny day, you can get a powerful flashlight and reflect it. So if the stone is here, you don't want to hit the face of it. You want to come across it, a raking light. That's what shadows, and that gives you the best photograph. And if you can't get a full photograph, you can do it in pieces. You know, they're making some pretty impressive work lights that are portable, lithium batteries. You can charge them up, use them all day long, and put an amazing amount of light on the stone as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit about stone identification. There's different types of stone, and that is important for certain treatments. Certain stones will take more aggressive treatments than others. Some are more reactive, whether it's an alkaline or an acidic treatment. So we want to be careful. We know what we're dealing with, and knowing the properties of that stone will help you understand why the stone is in the condition it's in, or if you do something to it, you may worsen the condition by using an improper treatment. So early cemeteries, again, we're going to be in a cemetery that dates to 1867. There are some stones in there that predate the cemetery because people were disinterred from a family plot and moved into the fashionable rural cemetery. You know, people dug up their parents and grandparents and moved them. Cemeteries get moved because they're in the inner city. They want that land for development, don't like the smells of the cemetery. They get moved to another cemetery. So you may find these dates a little bit off depending on where you are, and they may not fit the profile of the cemetery, but it'll also give you a clue if the stone is being used, or it may be backdated or things like that. So slate is one of the earliest forms in this country of carving for individual monuments and grave markers. It carves really nicely with a sharp chisel, holds up well if it's well bonded together, but if it doesn't, it starts coming apart along what we call the bedding planes. It cleaves where nature layered the layers of clay years ago. So, and depending how many impurities are in it, that can cause it to come apart as well. I didn't see any slate in this cemetery. That doesn't mean it's not there. Usually you'll see that before 1800, but they're using it regionally. Today, you can still get a slate hand-carved gravestone. I can give you the name of 3 different people in New England that will hand carve you a slate stone today. So it is still being used today, but much more costly, and even in some cemeteries, they have regulations against using certain types of stone. And if it's poor quality slate, there's a reason, because it doesn't hold up well. Good quality slate will last millennia. So the next type is sandstone, and there may be some sandstones. I think there are. Again, that's a material, it's more regionally, like Connecticut River Valley, the Hudson River Valley, New Jersey has a lot of sandstone that works for gravestones. The Connecticut stuff doesn't last much more than 50 years before it starts coming apart. There's sandstones from Ohio that last 200 years and look beautiful. So, and so knowing the chemical makeup does make a difference. Again, they're much more fragile, treated more gently. Marble and limestone, even though they look really, people will call marble stones limestone, but chemically they're the same. Geologically, the chemical makeup of calcium carbonate is very similar, but marble is spent more time under the earth, under pressure, under heat, and been more consistent. There's a lot of good limestone in the cemetery, even though it's 1867. There's a lot of limestone being used for bases, and there's even at least one obelisk, which is not a good material for an obelisk because it comes apart. The bedding planes are not as tight. They tend to separate and come apart. We got great examples of why not to use limestone in a monument in the cemetery. Marble is much more uniform. We think of it as like a marble floor or vanity or a countertop or something, you know, much more dense, has the veining through it. Again, that veining can be a real problem with marble because it's a different mineral in there that reacts differently to the environment and conditions. So Sometimes the veining is the detriment of the stone. Sometimes that's what's left, and the calcium carbonate erodes around it because of acid rain and pressure washing and other aggressive treatments. And of course, today, the main choice for material for gravestones is granite. Again, this is a piece of Barry granite from Barry, Vermont. There's granite all over. Some make better headstones than others. Some have great contrast that when you carve them, you can see the lettering. Other ones that it just becomes muddled in the patterning of the feldspar and everything that's in there. They don't show up very well. So, I mean, New England is loaded with granite. I mean, today's modern technology that was really developed back in the 1860s, and by 1870, it really becomes the most popular stone. We have pneumatics, we have carbide tips, we have diamond, we have technology to work that hard stone. It's not all being done with hammer and chisel. Pneumatic hammer and chisel, yes, but not by hand. So that's, and it will endure, but granite is not invincible either. You can destroy granite with poor treatment. And if you lived in the Southwest, I'd be giving a whole different lecture on how not to treat granite with spraying 45-degree cold water on a 120-degree day and this desurfacing, spalling the stone. So nothing is invincible. Carved in stone doesn't mean last forever. So, but why we're really here is to talk about conserving the stones, not restoration, conserving. We want to survey them. We have those forms. We can record the condition. We can identify the problems. You can't do all that without touching the stone sometimes. You can only see so much. There's stone in the ground, there's stone underground, there's previous treatments that have been done that may or may not be obvious. So it sounds simple, but that's kind of the hard part. And we'll be doing more of that in the cemetery tomorrow. Deciding on what treatments can be done and who can do them. Again, I don't want to offend anybody, but the first thing people think of when they talk about monuments is going to the local monument guy, because that's who does monuments. And they may not know previous treatments. They may not know how to deal with different types of stone. They may try harsh things on marble that they use on granite that will literally destroy the stone over time. So I'm going to teach you some of the ways that are best practices according to Secretary of Interior standards and other acceptable practices. And we'll do that more in person, keeping records of what's done, because you're not the first person to touch the stone. You won't be the last person to touch the stone. Something is going to happen to that. It will need to be done. So I've even been humbled by having to do some of those things to things that I've worked on myself because of a tree that comes down. Okay, you can't control that unless you prune your trees and deal with your landscape. Maybe you could have eliminated that. So if my repair has to be redone, I know what it was. It's easier to reverse than some of the other methods, going to the Home Depot, the Lowe's, the hardware store, and just buying something and slapping it on. Those things are very hard to reverse most of the time. The main principles are to do no harm. I mean, we all have good intentions, right? We're here because we care, but you need to know what harms. Just because you think you're doing a proper job, you can be doing harm without knowing it. That includes pressure washing, bleaching, and all the other things that have been done over the years to make them look good. Even doing harm by making things unstable, but they look good. Now you've endangered the general public. So we want to use reversible techniques and materials. And again, some things are more reversible than others. If things are structural, we're going to be using epoxies that are less reversible, but much safer for the stone and the general public. And we always want to preserve as much original material as possible. So when we talk about treatments and problems, everybody says, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to clean the stone. Cleaning the stone is a treatment. Everything that you're touching, unless you're just taking a photograph, you're doing something that could do harm to it or not. And we want to be careful about that. So cleaning stones, it's a very controversial issue, because are we doing it to make everything look like Arlington Cemetery? Everybody's not a bright white soldier in a line. There's This cemetery just shows the variety of stone types, how the diversity and the eclecticness of different monuments, and people use different materials. If we can read the monument, we really don't need to clean it. Its purpose is to memorialize that person. Everything doesn't need to look new. If we can read it, we probably shouldn't be cleaning it unless we're cleaning it in order to do another treatment of repair or reset. So, because when we go to clean, there's always a danger of doing harm. No matter how careful we are, we can do harm to a stone, because stone is not a perfect material. It's made under the ground. It's been taken out. It's sometimes sand. It's blasted out of the ground. It's jackhammered. It's cut. It's, all these different things are done to it. Then it's taken into a shop and it's worked and it's hammered and chiseled for a week at a time on the earlier stones. We've abused that stone already. And by doing harsh treatments, including cleaning, can minimize the life of that stone. So even though it may make it look really good for us today, we want that to be out there for generations to come. So harsh cleaning is a major problem where people think they can do no harm, yet they can. So we always want to use the gentlest means, and we're going to go over some of that now. We can clean the stone just with water. Water will probably not do any harm. Again, is it water under pressure? A pressure washer, 25, 3,200 PSI, you could blow a hole through these things. Even a garden type sprayer, okay, they go up to 45 PSI, a garden hose, maybe 100, depending on your well or municipal system, We can do a lot of harm with just water too. So, but we want to be careful to remember, do no harm. So water will clean most stone, and I'm going to go through this quick because I know we went long this morning. So we don't want to use pressure washers. We don't want to get hard and aggressive. Dampening the stone with water will help soften all that biological growth. And that's the main thing we're trying to clean off, is the biota that's on there. Again, certain people will say, well, the biota can create a biofilm that helps protect the stone, but if the stone is not legible, the stone's not doing its job. And as historians and genealogists and family members, we want to be able to read that stone, but we don't want to hurt it. So we can clean with just water, soft bristle brushes. We can do some scraping. We're going to go all over this in the field tomorrow, or Sunday, or both, depending on what we decide to do with the weather tomorrow. We can wet things down. Water can clean the stone. I mean, here's a couple that are completely covered in biota. This is a workshop from several years ago. We scrub from the bottom up. And again, people say, no, we clean from the top down. No, scrubbing from the bottom up and rinsing from the bottom up gives you the safest non-streaking clean. And that's been proven scientifically in studies. And my grandmother always said it, because when she washed the woodwork, the painted woodwork, you did that and then you got no streaks. So can't be wrong. So again, we scrub, we rinse. My hand will be on the stone sometimes, but I'm not leaning on the stone. We got to make sure that stone is stable before we begin. There's going to be stuff in the cemetery that doesn't look bad, but I could knock it over with a feather. And I don't know how the birds flying by and the winds don't knock some things over. Groundskeepers tend to, something's down, will stand it back up. Well, that might be a good idea if it's stable, but if it's not, now you've created a dangerous condition. You go to try to clean that, it could fall over on you. So we got to be super careful. Rinsing from the bottom up, and water will make the stone. There's almost the before and after. As you rinse, you see how that biota goes away. The problem with just water is it will give you a good result temporarily. All that biota needs moisture to thrive. It starts with an algae. A lichen is the main problem with most gravestones in the Northeast. Where we have nice clean air, you'll see lots of lichen growing, and they take many different forms. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship of an algae and a fungi living together. So they take many different forms. There's leafy ones, there's tight-knit ones, there's all different colors. They change different color as you kill them, like a deciduous tree in the fall. Your maple could be yellow, it could be orange, it could be red, it could be purple. Lichen do the same thing. As they die, they can change different colors. So if we're just brushing them off and rinsing them off and leaving water there, we may not have killed them. We may have made it look temporarily good. I've worked in some places where the clients were like, we're not using any chemicals. I said, well, water is a chemical. It's H2O. You know, that's just narrow-minded thinking, you know. Sometimes you want to do the least, but every stone only has so many cleanings in its lifetime. And if you clean it with water and then it comes back in 6 months or a year, then you clean it again, you've done 2 cleanings in a year. You shouldn't clean more than once every 5 years. And that's, and maybe even more than that, or depends on the environment, because every time you clean, you may remove some surface material, even with soft scrub brushes. So as we clean, we're trying to get a result that's acceptable, but not new. Anything that's exposed for many years will not come entirely clean with water or any particular treatment, unless you're sandblasting it down to bare stone and then you've lost your inscription. But we want to remove that ambient soiling. Depending on where you are, you know, there's lots of industrial pollution that leads to soiling. It also leads to acid rain. So, you know, we've got a lot of different things happening. But the biological material is the main thing that obscures the inscription. So that's what we're trying to do, is to, so beyond water, and again, these are conservator recommended things, and a lot of this is kind of old school. I'm not going to recommend a lot of these. They are safe, but they're not as effective. And again, if you're scrubbing and cleaning with ineffective products, then you've taken a cleaning away from that stone's life. So these I'm not going to go into. The main thing we're going to do and we're going to use in the field is a biocidal solution called D2. It's been out for about 2 decades now, at least, and it was formulated to clean the biota off of building surfaces. And that's its primary thing, but it's a great cemetery product. It was studied by the National Park Service and Harvard in a 6-year study for the VA of all these different treatments that the Veterans Administration was doing to national cemeteries. You know, each superintendent had their own idea of how they were going to keep those white soldiers all looking perfect, from pressure washing to bleaching to sandblasting to Clorox to all different horrible things. And they found that they were having to replace the stones too frequently because they were destroying them with their maintenance. So they asked the National Park Services division in Louisiana, called the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, which is shortened to ncptt.gov, gives you a great website for a lot of information. They've got great labs. They've done accelerated studies. They do sampling. They do all kinds of studies. They're on top of it for the National Parks Service, both in historic structures and in cemeteries. So it's a great resource as well. And that product was one they studied, did the least amount of harm and the best good without deteriorating those marble VA headstones that date back to the 70s. So that's one reason. And again, some of this other stuff is harder to use, maybe not as safe, expensive. We won't go into that too much. This is all in your handout, so I'm not going to sit there and read everything to you. But I do want to get to this one. The do not list is more important than the do list. And you'll find people doing this in the cemetery. And since this is being recorded, I'm going to be chastised by my wife for saying this, because I had to stop my own father-in-law from going to the cemetery to clean his grandparents' stone using one of these methods. I won't say what, but you know, people with good intentions, they do it to their own family stones. We're talking about doing it in a broader sense to other people's stones. So we really want to be careful, because we cannot do any harm or be feared that will be a lawsuit coming after us for doing harm. So if we do things that do no harm, there's no reason to sue. So we don't use pressure washers. Again, historic stone. A stone put in 10 years ago, if it's covered in lichen, it's a granite stone, modern stone, you may be able to pressure wash that safely. Again, not right up close, not with 3,500 PSI. There's a danger to disrupting the monument attachment system because modern monuments are generally two-piece. And if you pressure wash the joint, you'll blast that joint right out. That allows water to get under. That means it's going to freeze in the winter. It's going to topple over. Even if it's totally level, it can be undermined by harsh treatment. So that's why we say no pressure washers, but they can be used limited. We don't use acids or highly alkaline solutions. Again, you go to a masonry contractor, the first thing they want to do is throw some acid on that because it etches it. It looks so nice quickly, but you're chemically changing the surface. And we'll look at the surfaces on these stones in the cemetery. There are some really good quality marble here, and there's some really bad quality marble. They've all been suffered different treatments over the year, but they've all had the same weathering. So there's stones that still have the original polish on the surface, maybe 150 years later, probably imported Carrara marble or something that's much more dense and withstands the weathering better. And then there's others that you can't read that can be much newer because the acid rain is what is chemically changing the outer part of that surface. We have to remember almost every marble monument was polished when it was new. So we look at an old cemetery and we just have no idea what that looked like 150 years. I mean, it would have been gleaming in the sun. I mean, you probably would have had to have sunglasses to even stand how bright it was. But that acid rain has changed the outer surface of the stone from calcium carbonate to basically gypsum, which is your basic sheetrock or wallboard. So you put sheetrock out in the rain and what happens? It deteriorates. It softens it, it erodes away. It's a short, it happens over a long period of time, so it's not so obvious, but gypsum crusts, we can see where they're developing. They get a hard surface first, then they rot. They fall off in the rain, basically. So we don't want to do those acid treatments. We're doing the same thing Mother Nature is doing to this. So we don't want to use acids. Using abrasives. I've had monument companies, oh, we're going to do a light sandblast. You know, oh, that thing is white. It looks good. Well, what did it used to say? You know, because they're taking off maybe a 64th or a 32nd, or if they're going heavy, a 16th of an inch of surface just to make it look good again. And you're losing the point of these monuments. They're supposed to be memorials. Metal brushes, wire brushes, you know, get way too aggressive. These soft marble and sandstone and limestone, you can do amazing amount of damage in a short amount of time. And then everybody likes to put them on the end of a power drill or a grinder. There's a guy in Indiana who not only, we use nylon bristle or natural bristle, right? They're soft. Natural bristle are usually more costly. They don't last as long, less effective, but safe. Nylon, there's varying degrees of hardness of nylon brushes, and I'll show you that in the cemetery. Some can be used safely on granite, some only on marble. Well, he took the word nylon and changed that to Nylox, which is a wire wheel that's nylon encased and covered with an abrasive. Put it on a grinder and is taking the surface right off. And all that white powder is the dead lichen. No, that's the marble you've just ground off the surface. So again, don't do those things. Bleaches are really bad. They give you a good result at first. And I can show you a picture of a hero of the Civil War who was buried in Albany Rural Cemetery, served on picket boat #1 that sunk the Confederate Albemarle ram that was destroying our fleet up and down the coast. They put this monument in 1910, and you can hardly tell it's even a monument anymore because the local monument dealer son is a Civil War buff and goes in and throws straight Clorox on it every year before Memorial Day and walks away. He's melting the monument. It's a shame. It was such a gorgeous monument. So good intentions, bad serves, bad treatments will do amazing damage. So we don't want to clean anything that's using basic household cleaners. You know, there's a lot of things you can buy at Home Depot that say they're as good as other products, but they haven't been safely tested. Don't use them. Unstable monuments, and we'll talk about those. Whether it's dangerous, it's going to fall over, or Marble has been bedded like limestone in layers. In the earlier marbles, you'll see the bedding planes opening up. They have spalling or delamination where these flakes are coming off. And if you scrub the heck out of them, you're taking away the stone. And that spalling generally happens around where they did the carving. So now you've lost the most important part of the stone around the inscription. So now you lose the inscription. So cleaning too often, again, 3 to 5 years is a good term, probably closer to 5. People said, well, let's stop the acid rain. We'll put a protective coating on. You know, they've tried epoxy coatings and silicones. They trap moisture and cause the stone to deteriorate from the inside out. Bad idea. So if there's any doubt, don't use it. Use some common sense, which isn't necessarily common anymore. So now everybody wants to learn how to cleaning, and cleaning to me it's gratifying. And then what we're going to do in the field is we're going to use the D2 biocide, and the results won't be immediate. Come back in 6 weeks, come back in 6 months. Once we've killed the biota, and it helps to remove the staining as well. But Mother Nature does the rest. The stains fade, the sun bleaches out the stains. I mean, things, I've been in cemeteries where I know they've cleaned safely and say, oh my God, it almost looks like somebody's pressure washed. If it's good quality stone and it's cleaned gently, it can look as good as pressure washing without the negative results. But we also want to talk about doing some more. And again, I'm not expecting everybody to go out and grab a shovel and start doing this work and have all the equipment that's necessary, but we're going to teach you, whether you hire me or anybody else to do it, you want to know what's safe and what is a proper way of doing it. So we're going to first talk about leaning gravestones. So I'm calling a gravestone a tablet marker the same thing. So it's a single piece of stone in the ground. Up until about 1820, everything was one individual slab of stone in the ground. What you see out of the ground may be somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of the stone. A lot of times they're only 2 inches thick, sometimes thicker. The earlier ones are thicker because it was easier to work a bigger piece of stone. But as you get into the 19th century, they got more mechanization, more saws. They're making things. In Maine or some places, the stones are 1 inch, maybe 1.25 inches thick. Talk about fragile, standing them 4 feet out of the ground at 1.5 or 1.25 inches thick of marble. That's not good. But that's what we're going to focus on first, resetting a leaning gravestone. So we got to remember that stone is heavy. Marble is somewhere between 160, 170 pounds a cubic foot. Granite's a little bit heavier. But tablets are generally marble. There are some exceptions. I think there's some granite tablets that are later that are kind of like a colonial revival style, looking like an old stone, but made of modern materials. If you don't have the training, the equipment, and the know how to do it, don't start it. You don't want to start something, get halfway through, and I've got a problem. What do I do? Either because you don't have the equipment or the power, the manpower or the equipment or whatever to lift it properly, because everything is not as simple as it looks. You know, if you're working in Arlington where all the stones are the same, we know that every stone is 42 inches deep, it's 3 inches thick, it's this, it's that. We know what we're dealing with. The old stones, monument guys did different things. These stone cutters, stone carvers, a lot of them called themselves sculptors because they were doing really ornate work. They did different things. We don't know what's underground, so we have to be prepared for that. So when we're going to do did I get ahead of myself here? So, missing a slide. So there's 2 types of leans in a gravestone. So a lean forward and backward is much more dangerous to the stone than one side to side. A stone will break that way much easier than side to side. You almost never see them snap off. I've seen them leaning almost down to the ground this way and they don't break. But if they get more than 15 degrees, I think Peter was saying, you know, we've got a lot of these. This isn't bad. This isn't bad. Well, this is bad. 15 degrees is kind of critical mass before gravity tends to snap them off. So we want to be able to do that. Those are a higher priority when we're doing our So resetting a gravestone, once the stone is stable. So I use different methods for making it stable. If it's got a real bad lean, you can take a 2x4 and a clamp and hold it in place. I use a tripod for most of my lifting. I do a lot of work by myself, which people will tell you is not safe, but if you have the right equipment, that's your extra help. So I will establish a tripod, and we'll do this in the cemetery to help stabilize it so it can't fall over while we're working on it. If it's leaning backwards, we want to basically just straighten that stone back to plumb. If we grab that and do this, we're going to snap that off the ground level. I've had family members tell me horror stories. I broke Aunt Polly by trying to straighten it. You know, there's a rock, there's a root, there's something at ground level that creates a real rigid spot, and then it just acts as a fulcrum. You've got all that leverage in a 4-foot stone. It doesn't take much to snap it. It's much easier to reset the stone properly than fix it after you've broken it. It can be fixed, but it's never going to be the same. So if it's leaning one way, we remove the soil away from the lean. So if it's leaning backwards, we want to remove the soil here so that we can bring it back to plumb. And we don't stop digging till we find the bottom of that stone. We get 6 inches from the bottom and there's a root or a rock, and we try to do that, and we've created the same situation at ground level. We're going to snap that stone. So we remove as little soil as possible because soil compaction holds that stone in place. We're not puddling it in concrete. We're not the WPA or the CCC who went around doing all these great projects, just puddling all our veterans in cement and making a big mess. So we're gonna remove that soil. If there's roots, there's rocks, there's other things that are encountered, those come out. And then if we have a void, we will have to replace that with either like soil or a fine draining gravel so that frost doesn't get a hold of it, because the main problem with a tablet is frost. We're in the Northeast, you know, what's our frost depth up here? Probably 42 to 48 inches is frost depth. These stones are 2.5 feet in the ground. They don't go below frost, so they're susceptible to all that freeze. If you put something up against the stone, that gives the frost something to grab, and then it pushes. So if there's a rock on the front of the stone, it'll push it back. Many times I can tell where the rocks are going to be based on the angle of the stone. So once all that is out of there, we bring it back up to plumb, we repack the soil. We've already cut in a cemetery like this where we've got a nice sod, we cut our sod, we put it back. It looks like we've never been there except the stone is straight. So if we have to, like I say, a fine gravel, pea stone and sand works to make a nice fine gravel. It allows drainage, yet enough compaction to hold that stone there. And the problem with that is there's a book out there, and I don't think I've included it in the packet. There's a book called The Graveyard Preservation Primer. It's been 2 different editions been put out, but the person who wrote it is a conservator from the South, and she has so she has this diagram in her book. So putting material behind it to help brace it or underneath it, not a good idea. It works in South Carolina or Florida where you don't have all those freeze-thaw cycles. This is a recipe for disaster by putting this stuff behind it. And this actually shows you how a gravestone may be half in the ground, you know, and what's underground. I didn't touch on this. We don't have super early stones here, but the earlier the stone, the less finished the bottom of the stone is going to be. When you get into slates, they're very irregular underground. Marbles and sandstone, you'll see this kind of bulbous bottom. There's sometimes a shoulder where the stone comes down and like this, but that's underground. You don't see it. It just makes leveling really tricky. And if you try to put that material behind there with rocks like this, the frost is going to get underneath that and start pushing it. It's going to tip. So we're going to want nice draining soil or gravel beside it. Topsoil on top of that and sod on top of that. We don't want bare ground. We don't want the marble chips like people love to put around modern stones. We need to have that soil compact and rooted material to hold it in place. One of the issues with that is when we love to weed whack today, you know, we're trying to weed whack less. We tell the weed whackers not to get close. I'd rather see long grass around historic stones than have it all wire whipped. You know, you see the string marks on the stones. You can see where they're cutting through the stone. But then the next thing they love to do is take their weed whacker and angle it down and trench around it, because then they blow the roots out and it doesn't grow back as fast. So they don't have to weed whack every week. They can weed whack every couple of weeks. Well, you leave that soil without rooted mass, it erodes. And when it erodes, the stone chips. So here we go back to whose problem is the leaning gravestone or monument? Is it the families because it's their monument, or is it because of poor maintenance practices? They're creating the problem. And it's true of monuments too. So I don't want to offend, you know, anything anybody else has said, but you know, when stones are dangerous, yes, they're the family's problem, but what caused the problem? You know, stones just don't chip on their own. There's two reasons: roots, rocks, and then we get into monuments and bigger things. It's the natural subsidence of the grave. You know, we're talking about green burials and going back. I mean, most of these people were buried in pine boxes, in a shroud, in something. And if you talk to, you know, oh, there's nothing left there. That's all decayed. It's all gone away. That cavity may remain there for hundreds of years. I mean, how do we find prehistoric man buried? How do we, you know, everything doesn't rot away. Yes, under certain conditions, the human body decomposes, the bones go away, wood rots. Under other conditions, I worked on Revolutionary War soldiers killed in the war, that their coffin wood is still viable in the ground with the hand-cut rose nails. So if that's still there, the body parts are there, and then, you know, things subside when that does rot. You know, newer cemeteries, we're putting the vaults, the liners, keeps that subsides. When that grave settles, everything near it starts going towards the hole. So if the cemetery doesn't do their job of filling in sunken graves, which you'll see here, the older sections, it's not a golf course, you know, it's the rough. It isn't the green. It's you get all this, the undulating soil, the subsiding graves. And when that starts to, everything falls towards it. So you could have one grave impacting two stones on either side, because there's a grave here, then a body, then another gravestone here. So those two stones could be falling towards that sunken grave. So how do you say that's the family's fault when you didn't fill the grave? Your job at burying people and to maintain that landscape, your job is to fill that when it sinks. And it becomes, where does the money come from to get the fill? Who does it? I know it's a burden. We all deal with it, but part of your job, if you want to have that cemetery maintained and maintain the monument, you have to maintain the landscape in conjunction with it. So we don't do this in the Northeast. We can do that in the South, and maybe it will help support it, but with the freeze thaw, that will not work. So complications to resetting. It's simple. We're just going to dig. We're going to bring this back up. We're going to fill. It's never that simple. We're in a cemetery that has 150-year-old trees with roots. We've got rocks. We've got other people's previous repairs. We've got the concrete mass the WPA threw in there. We have a regular bottom, so they're not flat. It's hard to level something that's irregular on the bottom. So there's always some complications. Hopefully we'll have some fun with that tomorrow if it's not raining too hard. So that's the kind of thing anybody can do with a little bit of training and a little bit of equipment. It doesn't take a lot. We're not talking massive amounts of stone. We're not talking thousands of pounds. We're talking hundreds. We're talking things that can be done until you get into the complications where they're broken and all those other things. So beyond that, we're going to get into what I'm calling monuments, and I call anything that's more than one piece. Again, a monument can be one piece, but in regards to this, we're talking multiple piece monuments. So the way things were assembled over the years changes in time. And I wish we could go back to some of those. And I'm glad we don't go back to others, because some worked, some didn't. So we have all these different types of monuments, and there's others too. But these will go over. So we have a lot of these. This is a Catholic cemetery. You can tell by the nice crucifix on top. Nice Irish family in a Catholic cemetery in my hometown. So the O'Briens, again, this was one, the family's all long gone, or so we think. There's probably still somebody related, but the church felt this was dangerous. You can see how it's leaning. Everything is shifted. So these were just stacked joints. They would use lime putty or lime mortar to hold them together. Over time, that leaches out. It's like if you own a brick or stone building and you don't keep repointing it every 50 years or less, those joints fail. You have to repair them or you're going to have a problem. So that's one type. And again, once it starts leaning, this is a fairly substantial monument. That main pedestal shaft is probably about 700, 800 pounds, let alone the two bases and the crucifix and everything. So once it starts leaning, and in this cemetery, there's no concrete foundations. Portland cement concrete doesn't become popular in this country till the 20th century. They did use some natural lime cements that make foundations. Mainly they were dry laid stone or rubble foundations. And in this cemetery, almost everyone was, the monument guy was dealing both in marble, and then it's a later time they were dealing with granite. So in the granite industry, it seems like there's a lot more waste and they would always end up in the holes. That became the foundation. We just throw all this granite rubble in there and then stack the monument on top. Well, over time, critters get in there, chipmunks and everything, and they start moving things around. It starts to move. Well, it's still not bad. That monument was up for 120 years or more before it started to really lean back. That's pretty good. What would your house look like after 100 years with no maintenance? Absolutely nothing has happened to this probably in over 100 years. So it had to be disassembled, moved off. And instead of, here's where I don't want to offend the Division of Cemeteries, but we don't put concrete foundations underneath historic monuments as a rule. It's a bad practice. They were never used. They're difficult to work with when they fail. Concrete is a temporary material, so it will need to be replaced sooner rather than later. And the other big factor is in the historic cemetery, these monuments are put up sometimes years after the burials, and a central monument like this could be almost on top of an interment. So the last thing I want to dig in a historic cemetery is 4 feet down to put in concrete, or to go bigger than the monument to put the form in. And then even some of the more recent projects that I've seen go before the board, they're going to make a pad even a foot wider than the monument. Now you're almost guaranteed to dig into a grave to put the monument back up. And that's just disrespectful. That's the bottom line. We as one person in this business says, I don't want to meet my customers. It's there's stuff moving around. And again, once woodchucks are in the ground and start moving things around, the less we can dig, but make it stable and then do no harm and be able to fix it easy in the future is also. The other factor, most of these monuments, I'm going to say before 1900, before 1880, really, the bottoms of these base stone, the very base, is not flat on the bottom. I've worked on monuments that weighed over 4,000 pounds, just the base, that's over 4 feet square. In the measurement, if you measure from the top of the edge to the bottom, there was more than 4 inches of variance on the 4 corners. So how do you set that flat on a concrete base without shims or sprawls, to use their wording? And the bottom of the stone, I just showed a customer the other day, I was working in Burnt Hills in Schenectady County. The bottom of it was not only not flat, it was actually concave. Some of them are convex. If it's like a ship bottom, you set it on the concrete, it's gonna be like a weeble. It's gonna wobble till one corner hits. So I've worked on ones that, the earlier granite ones especially, and even early marble, they're not flat on the bottom. Nobody was ever going to see that. It was easier for them to work the stone foundation than to work the stone to get it to be flat. So here it is. Let's just put back together. That was leveled. So my recommendation, and from a historic preservation point, is to Maybe not, we were talking about pea stone and sand for tablets because that allows drainage. We want something that compacts a little better than that, but still behaves well over time. So we use, there's a couple different products. Crusher run is a common term from the quarry, you know, depending on the size. If you're doing a huge monument, you want like 2A modified, which is 3/4 and less stone with lots of stone dust. And you can pack that in like concrete. But that monument is going to lean at some point. If you do a 4 foot by 4 foot, 4 foot down, that's a lot of cubic feet of concrete. That thing leans. You've got to jackhammer it out and start over. And it will lean, especially in the old cemeteries where the landscape maintenance is not happening and they're still settling and things happen. So we will put a base of crushed stone that has a lot of stone dust in it. So it packs in. They use it for road base. They use it for driveway base. It packs well. But it's easy to modify to accommodate those irregular bases. And if it leans in the future, you're not jackhammering out a bunch of concrete. So just a little side tangent there, sorry. So another type is a mortise and tenon joinery. So this is actually a combination of two. This base is stacked on, this is two separate bases. So you have a mortise or a socket joint called in some places. And then the stone can either be, the whole stone can go down into that mortise and act as a tenon, or like this one, there's actually a stone tenon cut. So they cut out about 1 inch of stone around the bottom, which is a really poor design. Now you've taken the strong point of your monument and weakened it by carving with a hammer and chisel. So a lot of times those tenons will break off. So it leads to another complication, but we won't get into that. So this gets mortared together. We don't use any Portland cement in joints on historic marble. We will use Portland cement a little later. So Portland is a bad word. You'll learn to hate Portland by the time this lecture is over. So other methods are pinning the joints. Again, this was acceptable, starts being used probably 1830s. Different types of pins are used, different securings of the pins to the monuments. You don't take a 3/4 inch pin and cram it into a 3/4 inch hole. The hole has to have a sacrificial nature to it. So if you're going to have a 1/2 inch hole, 3/8 inch pin, it's mortared in. The mortar gives you a little sacrificialness. The pin holds the monument up, but allows some error when something happens to it, so it doesn't break the stone. If you make things too attached, the stone will break before the pin yields. Big problem with pins is most of them were iron or wrought iron or some form of early steel. What happens to anything ferrous when it gets enough water to it? It's great when the joints are good. Once that mortar leaches out, water gets in there, they rust, they corrode. And when it corrodes, it expands. And when it expands, that rusting steel is stronger than the marble. It blows the stone apart. The next problem is they used lead, they used mortar. And the other thing, depending on where you are, different places in New York have it, but in Maine, it's a regular occurrence. They use sulfur to set the pins. You can liquefy sulfur at a fairly low temperature, pour it in, and it hardens around the pin. So you can do one pin on the top that way, then set it on the other, have a pour hole and pour the sulfur in. Well, sulfur is our major problem with acid rain. It's the pollutant in diesel. That's why we have low sulfur diesel. That sulfur turns into sulfuric acid over time and eats the stone from the inside. So as time went on, they went to different methods of, using various copper alloys, brass, bronze, pins. I've seen copper wire, heavy wire used. A lot of times they would use old lamp, like gas lamp tubing and stuff like that to act as a pin. When the damage happens from an iron pin, it creates a real problem, and we'll show that a little bit later. So here it is right here. So there's the pinholes, there's the monument. Can you guess where the pins went up? And it literally blew the corners right off. And this one had happened so long ago that those corners disappear by lawnmowers running them over, whatever. They're no longer there. These can be reattached, but it becomes a lot more tricky. The one on the right, you can see these are still upright, but it's hard to see in this light. But right there's pin. There are pin, so these monuments are still up. The pins are rusting, blowing apart the stone, and at some point that corrosion stops and then starts to recede, and that pin is no longer anything but rust. So that could be possibly toppled over very easily. And then a horror story I can tell you from Labor Day weekend of 17 or 18, I was in St. Agnes Cemetery, Manans, finished a project. I went over to next door to Albany Rural, 467 acres of cemetery, to work on a Civil War major who rode with Grant and Lee on the day of Appomattox Courthouse. He was served on Grant, so he took the message to Lee and then rode with Lee. He's buried in Albany Rural, and the Civil War buff wanted me to work on his stone. It's, you know, in danger of falling over. So it's a big granite thing. He says it's really rocky. I said, that thing can't be big. And I put one finger on the stone like this, and like 3,000 pounds of granite wobbled like this. It was on a rubble foundation that had eroded. And as soon as I did that, the sirens started going on. Got cemetery police in Albany now, what's going on? And for the next 12 minutes, there was a horror story developing. There was a couple with their parents and two young boys that were walking in another section of the cemetery in one of the old carriageways, not the paved roadways. And what we figure happened is one boy was on one side of the stone, one on the other, and it was a stone that was pinned. It was still upright, but the pins had rotted off, and the one got behind it and pushed it over onto the other child. 350-pound stone. This is why dangerous condition grants are so important, because the family, it's the Van Allen family. I mean, there's sure thousands of descendants of them around, but nobody was paying attention to that plot, and it looked good. It looked stable, but a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old knocked it over on a 4-year-old.
Was the kid okay?
The kid, they never sued. I never heard final, but it was 12 minutes that the paramedics, the state police, the Manans police, the Albany County Sheriff were trying to find them in the cemetery, because they were about 200 yards off the main road on one of the old grassy carriageways in a 467-acre cemetery, reading names off the stones, trying to tell the police and the paramedics how to get there. They didn't yell or scream or anything. I was within 300 yards of them working on this other stone. And I'm like, what is going on? You know, they're just racing up and down the paved roadways until they finally, one of them came out finally. If I could have gotten over there in 5 minutes, less, 5 minutes, had the stone off the child. I mean, it sat on his head for at least 12 minutes while they responded. So pins are bad if they're going to rot. So when we replace pins, we use stainless pins, less corrosive. They will last longer. Nothing lasts forever, but that's the best we can do too, when they're needed for strength and stability. These monuments, when they're too thin, they can't just sit on a base. We don't epoxy courses of stone together. They have to be attached with a mortar, a setting compound, or something. And if they're too thin, they need to have a pin to give support. So I'm replacing pins all the time with more modern materials and trying to get rid of those. And that's tricky, but we'll see some of those examples hopefully in the cemetery. I know I've got one that doesn't have the pins in it. It'll show the method, and I'll show you the tools I use to take the pins out. Other monuments, the huge monuments like this one. This is the McCardle family. He was a Civil War general and mayor of Albany, founder of St. Agnes Cemetery. This is all held together by weight and lead. There is a lead joint that literally is between every course of stone. So there's nothing but gravity, the weight of the stone against that soft lead against the next stone. It bites and it will not move. I've seen monuments lean at 45-degree angles held together with lead and not fall off. Much more than that. And it was really fun to take that one apart too. That's a critical mass. You change the formula anywhere. So that is a good method. And if it's well maintained and it doesn't start coming out, it holds up for years. It keeps the stone there and keeps the majority of the water out. The modern method of doing it is what we call setting compound, monument setting compound. It's almost like window putty. Comes in a bucket, you roll it out, you put it around. It is slightly adhesive, but not really a true adhesive like a mortar. It doesn't really it keeps the moisture out, keeps the water from getting in, which will keep the freeze thaw cycle. If this fails, water gets between the courses, then water gets in there in the winter, then it freezes at night, picks the stone up. We've got documented cases where freeze cycles moving thousands of pounds of stone gradually every year, just from that winter freeze every year. So this keeps that out. It's the modern way of doing it. We use it on granite and sometimes bigger marble, but it's even a little controversial there. I think it lasts better than a lot of the lime mortars. So it's, if you don't have to do the job as often, that's a good thing, but it's still very reversible. And in this case, they're using these little plastic spacers, which is what modern monument guys do. And I hate them because they're not soft enough most of the time. They're not squishy. Like lead is soft enough, the stone bites. You put stone against nylon against stone, and if it's a flat, smooth surface, it can still slip. So I use lead still. I know lead's a 4-letter word, but literally. We have oftentimes things that just can't be repaired. We try to save all original material. That's our goal. It's just not realistic. I mean, things that are 200 years old have suffered all kinds of problems. Early stones, again, the way they were manufactured by hand, they created a lot of problems. The type of stone that's used, here's one that we're going to make a new base. So the tablet monument that goes into the ground, sometimes where that breaks off at ground level, either through bad repairs or lack of repair over time, or just that we call it inherent vice of the stone, bad quality stone, that can't be mended properly. And if we're trying to save all that inscription, that it usually breaks off just below the inscription at ground level. So this is a workshop put on by the National Park Service 15 years ago now, I guess. I'm getting old. So we had this slate stone that was broken off in the ground, and the slate underground was more like shale. It was really crumbly. There isn't much you can do to strengthen that. And all the inscription was above that rotten material. So the decision was made, if we sink it back in the ground at a level to support it, you're losing inscription. Well, that's not good. It's not doing its job as a marker. So the decision was made to make a base for that to go into that was going to be a subterranean base. So you didn't see it. So it looked like a tablet in the ground when you're finished, but gave it the support that it needed. So here's one of the ways we can actually use Portland cement safely. So we're going to, you see the row of, I should have thrown it. There's some other slates here in the same family. It belongs, that hole was excavated to make this base. So we're going to form a concrete base in the ground of a size that will accommodate that socket or mortise that we're going to make, like we saw on the other, that the stone will go down into. We only want that socket 2 inches deep. Any more than that joint becomes less than sacrificial. If we put it down a foot, it just doesn't have any flex, and it's going to break when something impacts. So by having it 2 inches deep, that is the standard over years for sockets and gravestones. It's what they've been doing for a long time, not an arbitrary figure. And we cast the base in concrete. So we're going to make the base big enough to support it, big enough to accommodate that mortise or socket, and have enough concrete around it to still be strong enough to support it. Concrete has to be at least 2 inches. I'm always going to say 3 or 4. You want that footprint big enough to withstand the stresses that are going to be on it. So we're making a base out of the ground. We can demonstrate this in the cemetery, or we can talk more about it in private or whatever. So we're making this base, and we're going to do it. In the past, people have made these bases in their garage, and they got to carry 300 pounds of concrete to the cemetery and sink them in the ground. Make the base in the ground, put your form, and if you do it with angles on top, you can put your form in the ground and still be able to take the form out without disrupting the base. So we have the form going in more than 2 inches below grade, so we can still put some soil and get grass growing back over. It's going to look like a tap. We pour our concrete. We're gonna use modern Portland cement concrete, but it's not gonna be in contact with our stone. It's gonna be everything but that mortise or socket. So what we do, so we put this at a subterranean level. We have our piece of 2-inch builder styrofoam that you can buy at Home Depot, Lowe's, wherever. Cut it to 1 inch, between 3/4 of an inch and 1 inch bigger than the base of your stone. So that gives you a mortar joint around your stone. If I'm not being clear, we can go over this again. So that gets submerged into the wet concrete. And then we have to, because the buoyancy of that styrofoam against the concrete, it wants to pop it out. So we strap it across to hold it in place. I like to use the high early strength, concrete, because it sets up a little bit quicker. So a lot of times you're using standard ready mix. You got to give it a good week to cure. And a lot of times I'm not working in a place for a whole week. So I use it's walk on or drive on at 8 or 10 hours. So I can pour a base one day and reset a stone the next. Just a little tip there. So we do this on the ground, and when that cures, we pull the form off, backfill all the dirt around. Now we've got this concrete base underground. We can pull the styrofoam out. Here's the styrofoam still in here. We pull the styrofoam out. Now we have our mortise for the stone to go back into. Here's the controversial part. That stone, here's the stone. It's now in 2 pieces here. This is all that was left of the stone. You can see how this is more like shale than slate. It's crumbling. But we have to save it because the inscription goes to here. We need about 4 inches to go into the mortise and still be above ground level. So the decision is, it's always a tough one. Do you cut a stone? Do you lose some original material to save the rest of the stone? The bottom part of the stone is just a support. The information that we want to save is up above. If we tried to put all of this into concrete in a deeper slot, it's going to break off again, and then it's not going to be as good. It's going to break off higher, then we're going to lose inscription. So, an agonizing decision to cut a stone. You know, people see this, oh, I can cut stone. Not really. This is an exception to the rule. This is a rare case, but it is something we do have to do. So it was cut off to make it flush. Now it sits on that base in the mortise, and then it gets mortared in. So here's the dry run. It's going into the base, being mortared in. A soft lime mortar is being applied, pointing it all in, bracing it so it's plumb and can't be moved till it sets. And then once that's cured, we can backfill the dirt over it. And now it looks like the tablet is in the ground like it originally was. But it's something that's completely reversible except for the cutting. We don't really want to be epoxying that tail back on the end, but we could take that out. If that mortar leaches out, if the concrete fails, it's all reversible. Epoxy repair in general, this is something that everybody likes to think it's not rocket science, but there's a few things you have to do to make it. Using the appropriate epoxy is important. You don't go to Ace, True Value, Home Depot, Lowe's, any of the other, it's the other one here in town, Do It Best. Okay, all the different hardware stores and buy anything that just because it says stone epoxy on it. Most of those hardware things are meant for interior application, maybe for a granite countertop or something that isn't outside suffering all those other effects of time and weather and everything else. So this is a stone that had been previously repaired. So the first thing we have to do is remove that previous repair. We don't layer repair on top of repair on top of repair. Before you know it, you've got a gap of material. Usually it breaks through the inscription. Now you're obscuring the inscription and it just looks hideous. So everything has to be reversed. This was one that had been done properly 10 years ago, mechanically chiseled off pretty easily. We do a dry run to make sure everything still fits. You know, we sometimes know who did the repair, sometimes we don't. Why did the epoxy fail? Did it not meet up good? Why, you know, there's many reasons for epoxies to fail. Could be just something hit it and it broke again right where it was supposed to. So we put it back together, make sure everything lines up, see if there's gaps. We don't want to apply epoxy where there's no stone. And there's a couple different theories, depending on how much these epoxies we use are stronger than the stone, which is a little bit controversial in itself because we want things to be sacrificial, like mortars are weaker than the stone. Epoxy does have to be stronger to be good. And if we apply too much epoxy, it gets to the outer surface. We don't want to see our epoxy. We don't want to create, these epoxies are hard resin. They create a water barrier. Water is wicking in and out of these stones with rain, with sucking it up out of the ground. If it hits a solid barrier across, there's a chance that it could pop that joint. The moisture has to get out, you get a freeze, it could blow that joint apart. So spot epoxying was done. It's not a really big stone. It's not one that's going to necessarily kill somebody if the epoxy fails. The theory was that the previous epoxy had been done all the way across and it failed. But I'm still not so sure because usually it's rising damp as a common term in masonry. Moisture comes out of the ground. You see the buildings, you see the bottom courses of buildings deteriorating sooner because the moisture is wicking up out of the ground or out of the foundation. This joint failed at the top joint, so it would have to be moisture coming down from the outside getting trapped and not getting out, which is possible but less likely than rising damp. So I'm not so sure what caused it. Probably some kids in the cemetery. It's in the middle of New Haven, Connecticut, in an old cemetery. Lots of kids in there. I mean, somebody knocked into it, busted it open. So spot epoxying was done instead of a permanent joint all the way across. Main thing is once you do that joint, yeah, I see so many repairs where people put things back together, clamp it and brace it together. Epoxies are slippery, mortars are slippery. You put something together and walk away, it can shift. You know, sometimes it's just careless work where, oh, they didn't really line it up well and maybe it was off by a 16th and they thought that was close because they were a carpenter. That's usually good enough for us carpenters, but not good enough in stone repair work. You know, I don't want to see any discrepancy. I want to see everything flush. So we clamp it with boards, hold it in place till you get that strong initial set anyway. So this was a little extreme with the amount of bracing on it. But again, when you got a workshop with a lot of people around, you don't want anybody going over and wiggling in between either. So brace it, and then that epoxy generally cures in about 24 hours. On a really hot day in the summer, 90 degrees, that initial set can be in 15 minutes that you are not going to move it. So make sure you have all your clamps, your boards, everything in place. Once you mix that epoxy on a really hot day, you got a limited amount of time. And there's some epoxies that are even faster. So be prepared, get it ready. And then once we're done with that, you're still going to have a gap where there's missing material where those two stones broke. And the more times it breaks, the longer it's down, the more it gets picked up, gets moved around, you have losses. When a stone breaks, it rolls. So you can often tell which way it originally broke because one edge is going to be really crisp and tight. The backside might be rounded, so it broke off backwards. And when it rolls, it chips. It usually breaks off heading forward just so it messes up your inscription. But once in a while, you get lucky. It's the backside that has the big gap. So when we have those, we have to fill that in. And especially if we're spot epoxying, we don't want any water to flow in there. Moisture gets into the stone just through the pores. Water running in there, and then if it freezes, you're going to have a freeze-thaw popping situation. So we take and patch those cracks or something that's missing with a line-based patching material. And you can tint it to match the stone. But with marble, it's very difficult. White marble, when we clean it, is still going to be gray. It's going to have some staining. If we're doing our repair all at once and we want to do an infill, if we match it to today's color, come back in 6 months, it's lightened up. Now the patch really stands out. So I use a marble patching material that looks more like the white marble underneath. If you broke the stone again, you saw that natural marble being very bright white. And then eventually it evens out over time. So we can patch a crack where a break was, or like here, it's a little hard to see. This is where pin had blown out a piece and the piece was missing. We can replicate that with that as well. And it looks pretty good. It's chemically compatible. It may show up for a while because of the starkness of the color, especially with that ugly black lichen that doesn't like to die even with D2. But it's a way to protect that and make it whole again. I can tell you a horror story. I just had this, we say make everything reversible. I worked on this project in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. I'm working on this old abandoned Jewish cemetery, been abandoned for over 100 years. But somebody was in there about 1950 repairing stuff and moving stuff around and making my life miserable. And I'm putting together these tablets and I'm missing a piece. I worked on it in the fall. I said, I'm going to wait. Maybe that piece will show up. So I went back this spring to do more work. Spent 2 weeks working, didn't materialize. I said, oh, I got to patch it. I've got a gaping hole in this stone and it just bugs me. I'm a perfectionist. So having this hole really irked me. It's like, I can't wait any longer. So I spent 3, maybe 4 hours rebuilding this patch, making it look like the rest of the stone. Did some more projects. 150 feet from where I was working, I started working on another section, took apart these other 2 graves on a Friday. Saturday, we had a horrible rainstorm. It washed me out. I went back Sunday morning and I look where I was just digging the day before and I see this spot of white in the dirt. I'm like, what is that? That wasn't there 2 days ago. The rain had washed away enough of the soil. So I started digging. It's a piece of marble. Oh, that's a piece of somebody's headstone. I started looking around and I'm working on about 13 graves all in this area and it doesn't fit anything here. And it's just all of a sudden the light went on. I said, no, can't be. No. So uphill, 153. I'm like, I can't read Hebrew, but I'm pretty sure by the shape, the style, take a picture, send it to the director of the synagogue next door. She sends it to the rabbi and they're like, yeah, that word continues through that piece. That's the piece after I just spent 3 hours. So now, because you want things to be reversible, that patch I put in was reversible, not necessarily easily reversible. In about a week's time, it really developed a pretty hard cure. So I had to chisel and drill and take all that patch out. Well, it wasn't just the one piece. I found the one piece, put it up there, and it was only missing. So I stormed back down the hill, start digging 6 inches away and 8 inches underground, found the piece that matched this piece. So I said, oh, that's it. Both pieces fit back in. So I had to chisel all that out and put it. And it's like, no, I'm foolish. I'm not dedicated. I'm foolish. So it's like, who would even, and the timing. I mean, I waited months. I said, oh, it's never going to show up. It's a 6-acre cemetery with 6,000 graves, 1,200 tombstones. How am I ever going to find that piece if it's not right in the immediate area? And I found stuff 20 feet away already, so I gave up the search. I said it could be buried. It could have been, somebody picked it up and threw it as a rock. So it's dedication or stupidity or whatever. But again, something helps you, whatever your beliefs are. I think there's a lot of forces out there beyond that kind of help us do our job. So that's the infilling of losses. And again, you can rebuild entire stones or parts of stones with that material. The other one next to it, I was missing some and I haven't found that. So I'm afraid to go back in the fall because it's going to materialize somewhere else. So this is some of the materials that I use. Again, we could talk individually. I know this is not a training session. Even if you were here for the next week, you could never learn all this proficiently. But I'm always there for questions. Here's some of the materials. The mortars I use, they're called naturally hydraulic lime. It's a product. The product I use is Saint Astier. It comes out of France. I get it through a company called limeworks.us down in Pennsylvania. Otterbein is a German brand. You can get that through atlaspreservation.com. I like the Saint Astier better. It's been studied a little more with Columbia University graduate programs. It's more consistent because there's different grades and their grades are always spot on for the hardness that you're looking for, where Otterbein, I've been told by some studies, it varies so that you think you're getting soft and you get hard, and that's not a good thing, or vice versa. So, I mean, they're both good products. There's other brands. There's Virginia Lime Works sells another brand. I think it comes out of England. We used to have it right in Hudson Valley. Rosendale Cement, if anybody's familiar with that, every brownstone built in New York City, the Erie Canal wouldn't have happened without the discovery or rediscovery of naturally hydraulic limes and natural cements. They harden quicker and will harden hydraulically underwater after a short cure. So they work really well, but they're chemically compatible. They allow moisture in, moisture out. They're not like Portland. They don't have all these residual salts that create problems. So it's a really good product. And St. Asti, right on the bag, it says since 30 BC. So it's been around a little while. Monument setting compound is that putty we use on bigger granite and more modern stones. Again, there's different brands of that. That's one I get from Vermont. I like the brand. The stone epoxies, I use 2 or 3 different ones, depending on what's available at the time and what I have open in my truck. And they're chemically all about the same. The Revo 15 is supposedly a really fast setting epoxy. I don't like it as much. It's cheaper and it's an Italian product, so I shouldn't add it. So, but the Akemi is another European product. The 2030, it's a knife grade epoxy. And then there's a 5010 that's a little bit harder, clear, more UV non-sensitive. It will not yellow and discolor, but my epoxies don't show. They're all internal. The restoration mortar that I use for those infills is St. Asti. It's a Lithomex. It's a proprietary product. It's an NHL 3.5 restoration mortar. I don't know what else they put in it because it's proprietary, but it's just awesome to work with. It's so much better than mixing lime and sand. It's a really fine product. You can make your own that are more affordable, but theirs is just so consistent. It's worth paying extra for it to have it the right way every time. Jan mortars are one that they're distributed through Cathedral Stone in Maryland. And some of their pointing mortars you can get without having to be certified, but their restoration mortar for marble, you actually have to go and take a 3-day class, I think, and be recertified every so often. And I'm not so sure what's in those products. They're proprietary as well, but I do like, and they're more expensive than the Lithomex. I really like Lithomex. So I'm not promoting any one brand. It's like D2 is a great biocide. There may be other things, but it's been tested well. Something I've used and know works well. The Monument supply houses in Vermont sell a lot of different epoxies and stuff. They make their own. I've had problems with some of them, not to mention any names, but you know, I trust these other products as I've used them for a long time. And any failures I've had, they're not a failure of the product. You know, there's something has impacted the stone. And this one cemetery I worked on, I mean, I even put 1/2-inch stainless pins in these monuments, and the lady calls me back and says, you know, this winter we had a windstorm and these monuments blew over. Really? So I go back there and it's an old the Baptist churchyard cemetery that's now on her private property. So she felt, well, there's also, I go and I'm like, what am I stepping in? Cow patties. I'm like, what's going on here? Her daughter let just the calves loose out there and they got into the cemetery. And you know, cows love to rub up against stuff, and they bent the 1/2-inch stainless pins without breaking the marble. I was surprised. I said, that was a heck of a windstorm because your house should be in the neighboring county if it bent those pins over. But there's all the cow plops right there, you know, so there's things happen in cemeteries when we're not there. So we say vandalism, we say neglect. It's really hard to predict sometimes what happened, but let's not complain about it. If we know it's a problem, fix it, but let's fix the stones and make them right again. So now at this point, I know I've gone probably too long, but that's my cell phone. If I don't have a stone hanging over my head, I will answer it. Great, emails work. If you don't get a response, call my cell phone because I'm just always too busy. You work 7 days a week, 10 months a year. So any questions at this point? I know I just threw a lot of stuff at you.
Yeah, I just working on the data. I'm the
Okay, the question is, have I heard of Monugrid? Yes, it is, again, it's not the cheapest thing in the world. It may help stabilize, where you're not using concrete footings. Monugrid is basically, it's some type of a plastic material. It's basically a grid work that you can put in there, fill with crushed stone, and then set your monument. It's supposed to displace the weight more evenly. I'm not impressed with it, I've seen it used, but again, how do you know unless you do two identical stones side by side? I mean, it's a good idea. It's an extra expense maybe that you can't always afford. Using just good crushed stone underneath there. Again, I wish I had some of that because the driveway I have to get into to this cemetery is not really a driveway in Philadelphia. And I'd love to put that in the driveway so my truck can drive up in there without sinking in the mud. But, I think you can do just as well with packing a base well. And again, with that, I think they're recommending going beyond the monument too. And again, that's, they use that material's been around to stabilize driveways, and a lot of it used for similar products for like historic sites that want to park on their grass. You can put this in, plant grass. You can